Scary stories and urban legends have been prevalent since the early internet, with stories like Ted the Caver igniting the imagination of users everywhere. Despite the niche of creepypasta as a medium, several of these stories have broken into the mainstream, being adapted into multitudes of games and films, and making a notable impression on internet culture. The most popular of these horror stories is the character of the Slender Man, a monster that made itself known even to mainstream audiences. But what about the monster that's themes of Lovecraftian horror and collaborative lore directly inspired even the Slender Man? What is the true story of the Rake? The Rake began as a collaborative project on a 4chan board in late 2005. An anonymous poster started a thread with the post, "Hey, let's make a new monster." Naturally, there were many ideas, but one stood out. Alright, this is for the people who like the 3 eyes, no apparent mouth, pale skin one. Here's what we've got so far. Humanoid, about 6 feet tall when standing, but usually crouches and walks on all fours. It has very pale skin. The face is blank, as in no nose, no mouth. However, it has 3 solid green eyes, one in the middle of its forehead, and the other 2 on either side of its head towards the back. Usually seen in front yards in suburban areas. Usually just watches the observer, but will stand up and attack if approached. When it attacks, a mouth opens up, as if a hinged skull that opens at the chin, reveals many tiny but dull teeth. Using the working name of Operation Crawler, many changes continued to be made to its design. The following is the final description that may sound a lot more familiar today. Approximately 6 feet tall, but seen crouching. Humanoid, pale grayish skin, 2 slightly larger than human eyes, no nose, mouth that is smaller than human, but when provoked or attacked, opens freely on a hinge down to the neckline, showing hundreds of dull but not blunt teeth. Unknown origin, unknown diet, seen in suburban areas. Opens its mouth and widens its eyes when provoked, attacks when approached. If not provoked or approached, just stares. According to KnowYourMeme.com, one of the earliest appearances of the story was posted to the personal blog of Something Awful user Brian Somerville on July 20th, 2006. It was the first story in a series entitled Horror Theater, but Somerville does not indicate if the text was taken from another website or if it was written specifically for that blog post. And now, we can get into the complete story of the Rake. The story opens up with a common introduction for many creepypasta that were shared at the time, the idea likely being to lead the audience into believing this was an actual account. During the summer of 2003, events in the northeastern United States involving a strange human-like creature sparked brief local media interest before an apparent blackout was enacted. Little or no information was left intact, as most online and written accounts of the creature were mysteriously destroyed. Primarily focused in rural New York State and once found in Idaho, self-proclaimed witnesses told stories of their encounters of a creature of unknown origin. Emotions range from extremely traumatic levels of fright and discomfort to an almost childlike sense of playfulness and curiosity. While their published versions are no longer on record, the memories remained powerful. Several of the involved parties began looking for answers that year. In early 2006, the collaboration had accumulated nearly 24 documents dating between the 12th century and present day, spanning 4 continents. In almost all cases, the stories were identical. I've been in contact with a member of this group and was able to get some excerpts from their upcoming book. This opening does a great job of setting the tone for the story, as it leaves the doubt in your mind. What if these stories are true? It's just a shame they never finished that book. A Suicide Note, 1964. As I prepare to take my life, I feel it necessary to assuage any guilt or pain I have introduced through this act. It is not the fault of anyone other than him. For once I awoke and felt his presence, and once I awoke and saw his form. Once again I awoke and heard his voice and looked into his eyes. I cannot sleep without fear of what I might next awake to experience. I cannot ever wake. Goodbye. Found in the same wooden box were 2 empty envelopes addressed to William and Rose, and 1 loose personal letter with no envelope. Dearest Lenny, I have prayed for you. He spoke your name. I really like this first entry, and it honestly gives me Lovecraftian vibes, as the idea of this creature being spoken about in vague terms and being held with some sort of reverence really drives home the fear that these people have around it. This really goes a long way in early on establishing the Rake as a mythical figure, and it goes to show sometimes less is more. A journal entry translated from Spanish, 1880. I have experienced the greatest terror. I have experienced the greatest terror. I have experienced the greatest terror. I see his eyes when I close mine. They are hollow, black. They saw me and pierced me. His wet hand. I will not sleep. His voice. Unintelligible text. Honestly, I would argue the Lovecraftian influence is even more obvious here, as the writer is driven mad to the point where the writing becomes unrecognizable and he's repeating himself constantly. A Mariner's Log, 1691. He came to me in my sleep. From the foot of my bed, I felt a sensation. He took everything. We must return to England. We shall not come here again at the request of the Rake. I remember finding this quite humorous when I covered this with my buddy on my podcast, Spooks Files. The idea of the Rake being an angry landlord who was evicting the writer came to mind immediately. However, in retrospect, this establishes a few things. The first mention of the Rake sitting at the end of someone's bed, which is now something that's synonymous with this character. And also, the Rake appears to be sentient and intelligent, as it spoke someone's name in a previous entry and has made its displeasure with this writer being in this location known. Up until now, we were unsure whether the Rake was some sort of mindless creature, as it's usually portrayed, honestly, to this date. So rereading this and seeing that it clearly has some sort of higher level of intelligence and almost a, I hate to use the word again, but Lovecraftian feel, as it's some sort of creature beyond our understanding. But now we get into the bulk of the story and what's likely the part of the story that most people remember. From a Witness, 2006. 3 years ago, I had just returned from a trip to Niagara Falls with my family for the 4th of July. We were all very exhausted after a long day of driving, so my husband and I put the kids straight to bed and called it a night. At about 4 a.m., I woke up thinking my husband had gotten up to use the restroom. I used the moment to steal back the sheets, only to wake him in the process. I apologized and told him I thought he was out of bed. When he turned to face me, he gasped and pulled his feet up from the end of the bed so quickly his knee almost knocked me out of the bed. He then grabbed me and said nothing. After adjusting to the dark for a half second, I was able to see what caused the strange reaction. At the foot of the bed, sitting and facing away from us, what was appeared to be a naked man or a large hairless dog of some sort. Its body position was disturbing and unnatural, as if it had been hit by a car or something. For some reason, I was not instantly frightened by it, but more concerned as to its condition. At this point, I was somewhat under the assumption that we were supposed to help him. My husband was peering over his arm and knee, tucked into the fetal position, occasionally glancing at me before returning to the creature. In a flurry of motion, it scrambled around the side of the bed, and then crawled quickly in a flailing sort of way right along the covers until it was less than a foot from my husband's face. It was completely silent for about 30 seconds, probably closer to 5, but it seemed like a while, just looking at my husband. It then placed its hand on his knee and ran into the hallway leading to the kids' rooms. I screamed and ran for the light switch, planning to stop this thing before it hurt my children. When I got to the hallway, the light from the bedroom was enough to see it crouching and hunched over about 20 feet away. It turned around and looked directly at me, covered in blood. I flipped the switch on the wall and saw my daughter, Clara. The creature ran down the stairs as my husband and I rushed to help our daughter. She was very badly injured and spoke only once more in her short life. She said, "He is the Rake." My husband drove his car into a lake that night while rushing our daughter to the hospital. They did not survive. Being a small town, news got around pretty quickly. The police were helpful at first, and the local newspaper took a lot of interest as well. However, the story was never published, and the local television news never followed up either. For several months, my son Justin and I stayed in a hotel near my parents' house. After we decided to return home, I began looking for answers myself. I eventually located a man in the next town over who had a similar story. We got in contact and talked about our experiences. He knew of 2 other people in New York who had seen the creature we now refer to as the Rake. It took the 4 of us 2 solid years of hunting on the internet and writing letters to come up with a small collection of what we believed to be accounts of the Rake. None of them gave any details, history, or follow-up. One journal had an entry involving the creature in its first 3 pages, then never mentioned it again. A ship's log explained nothing of the encounter, saying only that they were told to leave by the Rake. That was the last entry in the log. There were, however, many instances where this creature's visit was one of a series of visits with the same person. Multiple people also mentioned being spoken to, my daughter included. This led us to wonder if the Rake had visited any of us before our last encounter. I set up a digital recorder near my bed and left it running all night, every night, for 2 weeks. I would tediously scan through the sounds of me rolling around in my bed each day when I woke up. By the end of the 2nd week, I was quite used to the occasional sound of sleep while blurring through the recording at 8 times the normal speed. It still took almost an hour every day. On the first day of the 3rd week, I thought I heard something different. What I found was a shrill voice. It was the Rake. I can't listen to it long enough to even begin to transcribe it. I haven't let anyone listen to it. All I know is that I've heard it before, and I now believe that it spoke when it was sitting in front of my husband. I don't remember hearing anything at the time, but for some reason, the voice on the recorder immediately brings me back to that moment. The thoughts that must have gone through my daughter's head make me very upset. I have not seen the Rake since he ruined my life, but I know that he has been in my room while I slept. I know in fear that one night I'll wake up to see him staring at me. And that concludes the main creepypasta about the Rake. A thread about creating a monster develops with multitudes of authors over the years, culminating in what I believe to be a classic boogeyman story of the early internet. This story and its ideas would later have obvious influence on future creepypasta, most notably in the most famous of them all, Slender Man. However, even though the Rake didn't quite reach the mainstream notoriety of Slender Man, it still had an impact that is nothing to overlook. The most obvious is this particular trail cam picture of the Rake. This image is super prevalent around the internet to the point where most people who don't even know about the Rake or creepypasta at all have seen it. I think my buddy from Spooks Files said it best. Are you looking at this image of this mysterious trail cam creature?
Yes, I am.
You told me earlier that you had seen this image before. Can you elaborate on that?
So if you Google, you know what? I will prove it right here, right now. Creepy pic.
Well, maybe that wasn't the most eloquent, but I still think it makes our point. I still see this photo everywhere, and even if it's not attributed to the Rake, people will claim it's a skinwalker or something like that. Though that's not what an actual skinwalker is, but maybe that's a video for the future. What's interesting though, is the origins of this photo might not be what you think. In December of 2010, the photo was first seen on a local news broadcast in Louisiana, supposedly having been sent in by a viewer of the program who claimed their friend took the photo at a local hunting ground.
26. Okay, so you know how we ask you to send in your pics so we can put them in our newscast? Well, you gotta see what one viewer claims his friend found at a hunting camp in Berwick. I really don't even know what that is. The guy who sent it in didn't want us to mention his name, but tells us this is totally for real. He says last weekend his friend's family found one of their hunting camps destroyed, but the SIM card was still there, and so was this crazy image. I put the pic up on Facebook, and this is what...
Of course, this caught fire on the internet, with many pointing out its qualities and attributing it to be the Rake. Is it possible that the Rake was a real creature after all? That none of those stories were made up, but in fact, real? Well, don't hold your breath. It turns out the image was a hoax, but not necessarily from someone photoshopping a picture to look like the Rake. No, it turns out the image is an edited image of a creature called a Grim from the video game Resistance 3. This revelation has honestly been pretty eye-opening for me, as the origins of one of the most famous horror images on the internet comes from a video game. Well, probably. This seems to be debated online, with some even claiming it was a deliberate hoax made by the developers of Resistance 3 as advertising. I don't necessarily find this hard to believe, as unique forms of advertising were happening quite often at the time, with movies like The Dark Knight and Cloverfield having ARG advertising campaigns, and the Dante's Inferno video game staging fake religious protests and outrage over its subject material. However, I haven't been able to find anything conclusive. The Rake is a classic monster that has been around since the early internet, and there is a reason for it. Out of the early creepypasta that gained popularity, it is one of the best. Its original story isn't too long, but it made a huge impact on creepypasta as both an art form and its community. Regardless of the quality of the monster, what really intrigues me about this story is that it truly seems to be the truest form of internet horror. A creature with many collaborators who have come together to build a mythos and lore for the character, and unlike other major stories like The Slender Man, it's still in the public domain, which means it has the potential for internet creators to add their own take to the character. With that being said, I do believe we are in a resurgence of creepypasta and obscure internet horror. Sagan Hawks recently released a great video that delves into some of the more recent imaginings of these tales, and it got me thinking about the untapped potential of some of these early internet ideas. Seeing Morley Grove revitalize a Slender Man-like creature, and chainmail chasers turning the idea of Smile Dog and other chain letter stories into an actually terrifying concept makes me wonder. Maybe it's time for the first creepypasta monster to make its return. After all,